Welcome, everybody, to the Interventional Endoscopist Podcast. I'm your host, Munkabel Suchdev, and today I have the pleasure and honor to talk to Dr. Doug Adler, who probably doesn't need much of a introduction to the world of therapeutic endoscopy. But Dr. Adler, thanks for joining us. And how you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So the reason we wanted to interview you, obviously we'll get into it later on, was I wanted to talk about your journey from academia to what's called a hybrid practice. And I think it's really important these days because, as we both know, there's tons of young endoscopists graduating each year from interventional fellowship. And I think roughly about 90 to 100 fellows are graduating every year. And you know, there's only so many jobs in the academic world. And I think a lot of young physicians and older physicians are starting to look at hybrid practices and private practice as an alternative because there's just not the job market's not there. You know, unless you want to go, and nothing against people who live in North Dakota, but unless you want to go live in North or South Dakota, there's really not a lot of options out there, especially in big cities. So, so I think that's something we'll get into. But before we do that, just a little bit about you. Maybe I'll have you kind of introduce yourself first. Tell us about where you're at, and we'll go into your background as well.
Sure. So I'm in Denver right now. I've been in Denver now about 3.5 years, and I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Therapeutic Endoscopy, which is at Porter Adventist Hospital in Denver. I'm an employee of Peak Gastroenterology, which is a large multi-state private group, but I'm kind of on permanent loan to Advent Health. So I spend 99% of my time at Porter Adventist Hospital at the center, which we refer to as CATE. And before that, I'd been in academics for 20 years.
And so with that, you did your medical school training at Cornell and your residency at BI in Boston, which anybody who's an interventional knows that GI and interventional endoscopy is a great place to go. And you did your gastroenterology training at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester.
Right. And then I stayed in Rochester for my ERCP year. Back then, there were very, very few programs that would combine training, and there were very few people learning EUS. Mm-hmm. So I did 3 years of general GI in Rochester, and then I stayed for a year of ERCP. And when I say a year of ERCP, I mean a year of ERCP. I mean, we did very, very little else. I mean, it was ERCP all day, every day. That's just kind of how it was.
Yeah.
And then I realized about halfway through that year that I wanted to learn EUS, but there were very, very, very limited opportunities for me to learn EUS as the ERCP fellow at that time. I kind of begged, borrowed, and stole about 100 EUSs.
Uh-huh.
And that was enough to say to me, like, hey, you should learn this. And then I was able to be Doug Pleskow's inaugural EUS fellow at the BI Deaconess, where I'd been a resident. So Doug and I just kind of talked at DDW and kind of like had a handshake deal. And then 6 months later, I was in Doug's lab doing EUS.
Yeah. He's such a nice person. I've met him a few times, and he's always been just really, really pleasant. And who was your mentor for ERCP?
Well, it's an interesting question. So when I was a first, second, and third year, Todd Barron was my primary mentor. I worked with Todd on a lot of research projects. I think Todd and I had a dozen papers together when I was a fellow. I did some complex procedures with Todd as well. But the year that I was a fourth year was the year that Todd decamped for Mayo Scottsdale. So the year that I was actually an ERCP fellow, Todd was not there.
Right. He was down here for a year or two. Yeah.
Right. So I was essentially trained in ERCP kind of de facto by Todd to some extent, but during that fourth year by Mike Levy, who is unfortunately now passed,
yes.
Brett Peterson, and CJ Gustad. And I believe CJ is retired now.
Yeah. He joined Apollo, and then I don't know if he's still working for them or not, but
I don't know. I haven't seen CJ in a year or two.
Yeah. So also, I mean, it's a very impressive group of people to learn ERCP from.
And it was a very good group. And, I was taught EUS by primarily Doug. Doug had a junior partner at the time who also taught me EUS. And I also learned a lot of pancreatology along the way. Like I did a year in the pancreas clinic when I was a regular GI fellow with Randy Pearson. And even though that was a completely endoscopic year, like I use the things I learned in that year in the pancreas clinic every day.
Gotcha.
Okay. There's not a lot of places that have a full-time pancreas clinic, so it was a very good experience.
Yeah, no, I had the opportunity in my second year of residency to do a rotation at Mayo Rochester, and that was in 2001 to 2002, and it was October, so didn't get the full cold, but I got to work with the liver and GI group there, and it was such an impressive group of people and an impressive campus. It's kind of like Disneyland for physicians in some ways.
I mean, you can, again, I'm biased because I trained there, but it's probably the best hospital on earth. It's probably the best that humans can do.
Yeah, they do a wonderful job, and it's like this. Obviously in Rochester, Minnesota is not the biggest suburb or city in the world. It's just this little tiny place that's just dedicated to medicine and IBM.
Right. Yeah, no, we loved it though. I will tell you that my wife and I, we moved there from Boston. We really did not know what to expect. I'd only been there for my interview day.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, like we didn't like our 4 years in Rochester. We loved our 4 years in Rochester. Yeah. It was fantastic. It's not for everybody. I will say that it's not for everybody, but we had a fantastic experience there.
Yeah, no, yeah. And for the audience, I met you for the first time actually when you were a new attending at the University of Texas in Houston. I had interviewed there for a GI fellowship, and you were a new attending, and so that's the first time we met. And obviously,
I was a brand new attending.
And since then,
the paint was still wet.
Yeah, yeah. And our paths have crossed multiple times. I think actually I forgot to mention this to you, but when I started my GI training, which was 2006. I was at the first year fellows course in Chicago, and you were one of the faculty members there with Dr. Butani. And this was before the current ASGE Center, when they had that other lab, and we were in
Oak Brook.
Oak Brook, yep, near the place near McDonald's and the Marriott Hotel. So that was a very eventful course for us. We had a great time on the fellow side. There's some stories I can tell you later on sometime about what happened tonight. But it was a good week.
Cast is over.
All right. So, obviously we talked about some of the things we're going to, talk about in terms of your job and everything. But before we get into that, tell me a little bit about, if you're comfortable, a little bit about your family, your childhood, how you ended up being a physician, what your influences were, that sort of thing.
Sure. So I grew up on Long Island in New York. I went to SUNY Binghamton undergrad, and I was not one of those kids who always wanted to be a doctor. Like you meet those kids always want to be a doctor. I wasn't like that at all. I think if I hadn't gone to medical school, I probably would have gotten a PhD in astronomy, or I might have gone to film school. Like those were things that I thought about very seriously. And then when I had done a lot of math and science in high school. I was lucky enough to be in what they call SHP, which is this program through Columbia University where high schoolers can take math and science courses at Columbia on weekends. So like when I was in high school, on the weekends, I would take a train 50 miles in from Long Island, and I would take classes on physics and relativity and calculus. And this, that was what I did for fun in high school. You kind of a sense of kind of kid that I was. And then when I got to college, I really wasn't sure that I wanted to stay in the sciences. And then I sort of like experiment with some other stuff. And then sort of like one day I woke up and I was taking 4 science classes a term. I'd been doing that for a year or so, and I kind of didn't really realize how I got there. So I sort of like ended up sort of back in the sciences. And then I had debated very seriously getting a PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry. And I spent a lot of college trying to decide, should I get a PhD or should I go to medical school? Should I get a PhD or should I go to medical school? And then I volunteered at a small hospital in upstate New York near my college. It was then called Binghamton General. I have no idea what it's called now. I'm sure it's changed name 6 times. And then the same year I did that, I lived and worked at Cold Spring Harbor. I was what they call an ERP. ERP is the undergraduate research program. They've been doing it at Cold Spring Harbor for like half a century. And it's kind of like a molecular biology boot camp.
Oh, wow.
It was 24 hours a day. I mean, it was a very, very intense experience there, working in a lab under a senior PI, getting a project that was probably more than they should have given an undergrad, but that's what they gave us. And sort of, running your gels and doing everything on your own. And sort of at the end of all that, I decided I thought that medicine was a better fit for my personality. And no disrespect to the PhDs, I thought the doctors I met were happier. Like they just seemed like they had sort of like a happier overall affect than a lot of the PhDs. And I remember being very affected by the fact that the docs just seemed more satisfied and happier. So I fell one side and I applied to medical school. So I ended up at Cornell, which was a very intense experience. Cornell in the 90s was no joke. They were very, very serious. And if you ever complained, they would just say, well, that's the Cornell way. That was something. No, it's true. That's something we heard a lot at Cornell. And then a lot of people don't know this, but I actually, when I graduated medical school, I matched into psychiatry.
Okay.
And I did a year of psychiatry at the VI. And then I during med school, I had been on that med psych fence. And then I decided, well, let me see how psychiatry goes. But by about halfway through the first year, I decided that I probably was more interested in internal medicine. So I completed that psych year. But I did go back into the match, and I interviewed all around the country, and I matched at the same hospital I was at already.
Oh, that's amazing.
So I ended up staying at the BI Deaconess for 3 years of internal medicine. So, and then after that, I was out to Mayo.
Yeah. So what kind of influenced you in residency to look at GI as your future?
Well, I was very heavily influenced by my time in psychiatry, because I had learned that as interesting as psychiatry was, like I needed to use my hands like that. So I was very aware, like, oh, I need to do something with procedures. Like I had learned as a med student, I really didn't want to be a surgeon. I didn't particularly enjoy my time in the OR. And I thought that I would have. Like I remember when I started my surgery rotations the third year, I was really, really excited. But like by the end of the second or third week, I was like, I don't think so. Like I don't think I want to, tie knots for 40 years. But I kind of realized that I didn't want to do something with procedures. So when I got to my medicine residency, I kind of hit the ground running, looking at who was doing procedures, who was working with technology, and that sort of thing. So then, very quickly I was looking at pulmonary, cardiology, and GI. And then I had very, very strong gastroenterologists around me at the BI Deaconess. And I was watching procedures, and I was thinking about maybe I should be a transplant hepatologist or maybe an endoscopy thing. Who knew? But by the end of my internship, I was basically decided that I would go into GI. So it was a little different then, because we applied in our second year.
Right. Yeah.
And I applied the year that the match collapsed. So when I applied to the match, there was a lot of suspicion that the match wasn't going to go. And I distinctly remember having an NRMP number and calling the NRMP and saying, like, we keep hearing that the match is going to collapse. And the NRMP said to me, the match will definitely not collapse. There's going to be a match. Be ready for the match. And the match collapsed. And it became a free-for-all. And I remember there was about 72 hours where I basically didn't go in. Like, I just sat at home by the phone. That's how it was. Nobody had a cell phone. You had to have a private place to talk if they called you. And I remember just saying, to the hospital, like, hey, this is what's going on. There's chaos nationwide. I have to be available in case they call. And that's literally what happened. Like, if you got the call, you could get a spot. And if you didn't answer, they moved on. So there's about a 72-hour period of collective chaos, and people were running around with their hair on fire, and it was hysteria. Like, it sounds funny. No,
it wasn't at a time.
It was a terrible thing.
Yeah.
And then sort of at the end of the 72 hours, I had a signed letter from Randy Pearson, the program director, and I was going to Rochester. So that's kind of how I ended up out there.
And was that, at that time, was it a 3-year or was it a 2-year fellowship at that time?
It was 3 years. So the GI had turned to 3 years just a few years before. So, like, for example, when I was an intern, the graduating GI fellows were 2-year fellows. Right. And then I think when I was a second year, GI it had gone to 3 years. So they had just kind of switched it.
Yeah, which is interesting, because I think there's a lot of discussion now if they should go back to a 2-year program now, where the third year would be, that's where you decide if you're going to be an interventionalist or an IBD or hepatologist or whatever.
Not a bad idea.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. I think one of the reasons that 3 years helps it, a lot of the academic institutions can get a good amount of research out of some of their fellows, the ones that are at the kind of high end of the academia world. So,
and I think that there's some programs where there's a real expectation of research, but I think that having been said, most of these fellowships nowadays, they're very heavily clinical, and there's not a lot of research expectations at all at most fellowships. Like, they send a poster in to a meeting, but I kind of feel like among fellows, as among attendings, 90% of the research is produced by 10% of the people. Like, the people who write and are doing projects are doing it a lot, and the people who aren't doing it are doing it never.
Right. Which actually reminds me. So when you interviewed me, and I use this sentence when I talk to medical students who are, medical students who are applying for residency now. When you interviewed me, my CV had a lot of abstracts on it and very few papers. And you pointed out to me, you said, you really should have a 1-to-1 ratio. Every abstract or poster.
It does sound like something I would say.
Oh, you said it. I remember it stuck with me, and I actually tell people that there is, if you're applying, you don't want to have 50 posters in one paper. You want to, you're not exactly ever going to be 1-to-1, but you want to have a significant number of papers for every poster you do. So, and right. So that's something
that the bar for abstracts is very low, because
right.
the meetings want to accept abstracts, so people rent a hotel room and the fee to go to the meeting. So, like, whereas papers go through peer review, abstracts go through peer review, but it's kind of with like a lowercase p.
Oh yeah. I've been on that. I've been on the other side reviewing posters, and it's very quick. You get through 100 of them in like 2 hours, and it's really a group decision each time. So,
right. And most of them get accepted.
Yeah, for sure. It has to be really bad to not get accepted for the most part. So, obviously, when you went to Rochester, you had some goals in your mind, right? What you wanted to do when you grew up, so to speak. And how did those evolve? Like, what was your goal or your target when you started your GI fellowship versus when you finished your interventional year and got your second interventional fellowship and got into the workforce?
So I had, I'm the only physician in my family, so I didn't really have like any sort of like role model in the family. So I didn't, like a lot of people in that situation, I didn't know a ton. I was kind of winging it. When I got to Rochester, I hadn't really thought about an academic career. Like, I didn't know a lot about that. The BI Deaconess was what they call an open hospital. Like, there were Harvard faculty who worked there, but there were a lot of private practice docs too that were our attendings and ran rounds and, like, had admitting privileges. So, like, it wasn't a closed system. So we saw a lot of, and predominantly private practice docs. I remember when I went out to Rochester, I thought, well, I'll probably go to practice somewhere. And then, it's a hyper academic environment in Rochester.
Yeah.
There's a lot of focus on training people to sort of swim in those waters. And when I was a second year, my main project with Todd Barron was on duodenal stents, and I was like thinking about duodenal stents and writing about duodenal stents. We had a couple of papers. We had a big paper that was in the Red Journal, got an editorial. It was a big deal. And then I was doing these procedures with Todd. He was teaching me how to do stuff. And I went to DDW, and there was a forum on duodenal stents. And I remember I went and I was like, 80 rows back. and at some point, the speaker on duodenal stents said how many he had done. And I had done like 3 times as many. And I remember I got kind of mad. And I remember thinking, like, why am I sitting out here? Like, I should be up there.
Right.
Like, I know way more than this guy.
Yeah.
And then I remember my wife was wandering around the convention center, and I found her after that talk, and I said, I'm going into academics. Like, it was like that talk kind of made me say, yeah, I need to write and speak about these things because I care about them. So that was kind of a big impetus for me. So when I left my training, I only looked at academic jobs. Like, I only considered essentially, for all intents and purposes, an academic career.
Okay.
And then I ended up at UT Houston for my first job where we met. And I was there 3 years. And then I moved to Salt Lake, and I was at the University of Utah 15, 16 years, something like that, before I came here. And I loved my time in academics. Like, I don't regret it at all.
Uh-huh.
I really, really enjoyed it. I got to do a lot of great stuff. I was fellowship director at the University of Utah, general GI fellowship for 7 years. That's something that, like, I think about all the time. It was one of the best things I ever did. So, like, for me, like, I really, really, really wanted to have an academic career. So I ended up, I think, one of only 2 tenured professors in all of GI. When I left the University of Utah, I think there were like 26, 27 GI docs, and only 2 of us were tenured professors.
Wow, that's awesome. So let's talk about that transition from Utah to Denver. So what were kind of some of the thought processes behind leaving the world of academics, going into essentially a hybrid practice, which is basically a private, and Peak is a private.
It isn't though. We'll get there.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about the change and then go and kind of explore that deeper. So,
yeah, I mean, I was, I'd been in academics for 20 solid years. And I kind of felt like I had done everything. Like, I actually even said that to my chief at one point, like, is there anything left for me to do here? Like, I kind of wasn't sure if the answer to that was something or nothing. And then, like a lot of places, the University of Utah left a salary model, which I preferred for a university setting. And then they switched us to RVU,
right.
Which I think a lot of people are discovering doesn't make a lot of sense for an academic university model.
Yeah. No.
And I remember when at faculty meeting, when they announced that we were going RVU, I remember I said at that faculty meeting to the assembled division, I said, we're in practice now. Like, you guys may not realize this, but the minute they make this RVUs, we're in practice. And people were like, no, but it's true. It's totally true. And for example, I was fellowship director during that transition. And, people went from saying, hey, can I have a fellow? Can I have a fellow? Can I have a fellow? I'd love to have a fellow. Why doesn't the fellow ever want to work with me? To, don't put the fellow in my room.
Yep.
No fellows for me. I got to go fast. I got to hit my RVU targets. I got to go. And, seeing stuff like that and other factors kind of made me say, like, it was time to do something different. And so that decision, that was slow in coming. Like, I'd been in that world for 2 decades, and like, that took many, many moons to sort of like that thought to work through my brain and realize that, like, oh, time to go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I have three partners, all of whom you know, and some of them you were in Rochester. One of them you were in Rochester with Jay Kim, but those three guys were at the Mayo Scottsdale for 9 to 10 years each, and it took them a while to realize that they wanted to do something different as well. And Mayo's a little different than some of the other traditional academic jobs at the time. Back in their up until 2010, and so. It took a little while for them to realize that that's what they wanted to do as well.
Right. And then, once you have that thought, hey, maybe I should try something different. It's very hard to not have that thought. Like, you can't put that genie back in the bottle, right?
Yeah,
like, that's Pandora's box. Like, I never thought that before, but I remember I was driving when I had that thought for the first time. And I remember being like,
So we've talked a little bit, we've batted the term around, and I think you've said the term too, hybrid practice. So what is your definition of a hybrid practice?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I imagine mine's different than other people's. So like my job, like I'm employed by a private practice, like peak gastroenterology, private practice. But my job has a lot of things that people wouldn't expect my job to have. And like, for example, I'm going to describe my job here, and it's going to sound an awful lot like a university. So I have every day med students on my team, residents on my team, a general GI fellow, and an advanced endoscopy fellow. I have a study coordinator. We have an IRB. I think I published 55 papers last year. I have an academic appointment. Like, sounds a lot like a university, but I work all day long in a private hospital that is part of a private system. So it runs like a private hospital. And a lot of these things we built, like before we got there, me and some of my partners, like they didn't have relationships with medical schools or, like we started the advanced fellowship for nothing, it was just, we built this stuff around us. So, it's funny because day to day, my life isn't very different than it was at the university in all of the best ways. Like I'm doing projects, I'm writing papers, I'm editing GIE, like I'm doing all the academic work that I always loved and that meant so much to me. But I'm doing an environment that's more flexible, and that gives a lot more autonomy. And I think a lot of people chafe in the academic world at a lack of autonomy, and I was one of those people. And for example, in a private hospital, you have a lot more autonomy. You can say, I would like this device, and it's a lot easier to get the device. You can say, I want to change my schedule or not see this kind of patient. Like, you have a lot more ability to direct your own life and your own schedule and your own day and your own interests. Whereas I felt that in an academic environment, you often had to take it back to your chief, who had to take it to the chair, and you were kind of like waiting for someone to tell you that something was okay or not. I'm like, for example, I distinctly remember in Utah saying like, hey, we should do procedure X or we should buy machine Y, and being told like, oh, we're not going to do that. And like, that wouldn't happen in this situation now. Like, I would just say, I'm doing it. And I would just do it. You know what I'm saying? Like,
100%.
There's no one to ask. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can just do it.
Yeah. And so do you miss anything about the academic world in your current role? Because it sounds like you've got the best of what you enjoy doing there, but is there something missing?
It's funny because I don't actually miss being a university faculty, just because I feel like I'm doing all the things that made me happy in the university system now. Like, I teach every day, give a ton of lectures. I travel all over the country. I mentor people. So I don't actually miss it. And that's something that's kind of shocking for me, of all people, to say, because I was one of the most rah, gung-ho, dyed-in-the-wool academic people that there was. But for me, I kind of felt like I'd done it. And, it was time to put that on the shelf and do something different. And it's been very, very exciting and gratifying to build, to like when we got here, I mean, it was tumbleweeds. Like we started from scratch. And it's been very, very gratifying to build an exceptionally busy advanced practice and center, in a new city. So
yeah,
again, I don't want to overemphasize and make it sound like it was easy like that. The first 6 months, there were many times where I, would think, what have I done?
Mm-hmm.
Like I walked away from a tenured professorship at a big university. Who on earth does that? Right? Nobody.
No,
Does that.
very few people. Very rare.
I had a job for life if I wanted it. But the problem was I didn't want it. You know what I'm saying? So like it took a while before I kind of realized like, oh, we're going to make it, because you just have to start from nothing.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes building programs is really, building a program, not sometimes, whenever you do get the opportunity to build something, it's very gratifying. I mean, you get to create something that wasn't there before, and you have that know-how, and you get to add in, an advanced tissue resection program or an advanced biliary program or whatever it is. And you get to grow that. And, there's a little satisfaction in that. And there's also some satisfaction in bringing something that the local community hasn't seen before,
Right.
So
and we get calls from all over our whole Mountain West region. Like my cell phone's never off. Like people call me 24/7. Hey, I got this guy. He's a disaster. Can I send him to you? We've tried 4 times. Nobody can do this. Can you transfer him? Like our answer is, with profoundly rare exceptions, send him.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's kind of like our place in the ecosystem here. I saw a movie earlier today, and while I was at the movie, I was getting messages on Epic. I was that guy who like took out his phone in the movie, like they tell you not to do. And a guy messaged me, like me and 2 of my partners have each tried to ERCP this guy, and nobody can get in. And I just like right there in the movie, I was like, send him over. So he's on the schedule for tomorrow.
But what movie were you watching out of curiosity?
I was at The Substance with Demi Moore.
Oh, okay.
So it just came out. It was great, but that's another podcast.
Yeah. One of my mentors, and it was, I believe it's John Martin told me, when you accept a transfer, the answer is, thank you. Can I have another one?
Right.
And I think that's the way to teach. I taught my fellows is that, never be that guy who's like, why are you transferring this person? What the hell? Kind of like some people get in the habit in fellowship or residency of, fighting off consults or whatever. In our world, where we're working at private institutions, it's about, thank you, send more, and
right.
And that's it,
right.
Be available.
And you want people to think of you when they're in a clinical dilemma or with a tougher or complex patient. You know what I'm saying? Like that's like our lifeblood. That's what's interesting and motivating.
Yeah.
So, like I said, we virtually never, ever, ever say no.
Right. I mean, I think there's I've heard this before. The rule of A, accept, be agreeable, be affable, be appreciative. And if you,
it's funny, I heard it a different way. I heard it as the 4 A's.
Mm-hmm.
You got to be approachable,
okay,
knowable, affable, and able.
Able. That might be what it was. Yeah,
that's how I always heard that, as the 4 A's. And the joke was, you couldn't have 3, you had to have 4.
Well, I think especially in the private institutions and whatnot. I mean, if you don't be that way, then they'll find somebody else.
And you got to be willing. I mean, if you're going to hang out your shingle and say you're an advanced person, you got to be willing to take on complex, sick people.
Yeah, absolutely. And
a lot of people, I think one of the downsides of advanced training, I was actually talking about this with John Martin a little bit just over the weekend. He and I were both in Chicago for a course together we were speaking at. And I think a lot of people, when they do their advanced training, they realize that their risk tolerance is not as high as they thought.
Yeah.
And you kind of can't learn that about yourself until, you're doing some very, very, complicated stuff. It's like a high wire act.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's why, for example, you see a lot of people who do these fourth years, and then 2 years later, they're doing mostly general GI, and that's not wrong. I don't think it's bad. I don't think you should practice above your level of comfort. But I think for a lot of people, they come out of their fourth year and they say like, well, I'm not going to do A, B, C, or D. I'll just stick to, X, Y, and Z because those are more comfortable for me. And everybody kind of has to find that personal balance.
No, absolutely. And, just my personal experience is, early in my career, I had two lawsuits. Actually, found out about them both on the same day.
Oh my God!
Then
you took those Xanax.
Yeah, and the stress level, and initially you're doubting yourself, and you don't want to do any more procedures, and your body's shaking to the core. And I don't know what it would be like to find out about one lawsuit, and that's what it feels like. I found out about two on the same day, but they weren't filed at the same time. I found out about them because they were in the system. And, it took me about a month or two to really kind of say, okay, look, introspect and say, what do I really want to do? Do I want to keep doing the interventional stuff that I spent a year learning? And, my story is that I spent a year away from my daughter and wife when I was in Chicago. They were in Memphis. And I said, I sacrificed a full year of my daughter's life, a full year of my marriage to learn these procedures. Right. And I'm not going to let a lawsuit that in my mind was not really valid at the time stop me. So it took me about 2 or 3 months, but I got back on the horse. And I don't know that everybody does that, and right. and it changes you. And, also depends on who you're working with. If you're working with a bunch of physicians who are risk averse, that rubs off on you, or vice versa, so.
Right. Or if the senior partner tells you, dial it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's hard. And I distinctly remember in my first year, so, some people want a job where there's 3, 4, 5 other people around them. When I finished training, I was actually looking for a place that didn't have anybody. Mm-hmm. I wanted to kind of be, the go-to person.
The man. Yeah.
So when I took that job at UT Houston, that job had a lot of pluses and a lot of minuses, in all fairness. One of the reasons I took that job is I was it. So I was the sole provider covering probably about 800 beds a day for advanced. And because of that, I was the only one on call. So I was at UT for 3 years. So I took 1,000 days of straight call.
Right.
And I always like to say, that was the best thing about my job. Like I walked out of there 3 years later with 10 years of volume under my belt. Like it was a very, very, very good experience. But because I was alone, I remembered the very first ERCP I ever did. I made a point of doing an ERCP on my very first day I showed up. And then I realized in the middle of the case that if I got in trouble, there was no one. That was it. And I just remember deciding, well, I just have to get in every single time. Like that's just the answer. Annulate every single time, and there's no way. That's it. And that was kind of my mindset going into every single case. Like we're just going to succeed here no matter what. And that was kind of how I survived 3 years as a fresh attending, covering 2 enormous hospitals by myself. I paid a big price for that. I was leaving my house very early and getting home very, very late at night. I had an infant, a toddler, and plenty of days I got home and they were both already asleep. And it was hard. It was a very, very busy, dense 3 years. But I will never regret the experience I got there endoscopically. Like when I got to Utah, even though I was only 3 years out of training, it was apparent that I was the most experienced advanced person in the state. Right. Even though I was 3 years out, because I had done such a crazy volume in Texas.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about being there and then realizing you're it, I mean, we're all used to in your fellowship, and I would have John or Sri or Raj there. And if I'm struggling after, however much time I knew that they were comfortable giving me an attempt to get in, I just hand the scope this way to my left, and they're there. And the first time I wasn't getting in, I looked to my left, and there was nobody there. So
hey, there was a nurse. Now what?
Oh shit! So I got to go do this. So
no, that's what I mean. You got to get in. Gotta get in.
Yeah, so those, I think my first year, and I'm sure you had those experiences too, where ERCPs could go 2 to 4 hours because you were just like, I've got to do this. And as you mature and get better at it, you don't necessarily need that much time. But so moving kind of to the future here with interventional, now that you're in your setup, you're doing all the cases you want to, what are some of the new things that are coming out that you're excited about for in terms of interventional endoscopy?
Well, I'll tell you what I think is the biggest thing that is coming, that it's not quite here in the U.S., but I can't stop reading about it, and it's ERAT.
Okay.
It's endoscopic retrograde appendiceal therapy or appendicitis therapy, depending on what paper you read. So I guess, yeah, that's all over Asia, especially China.
Yep.
And in China, a lot of Western docs, especially docs in the United States, they've never heard of this. They know nothing about it. General surgeons in the United States have never heard of this. But the idea is that somebody gets acute appendicitis, and you prep them, and you take them for a colonoscopy, and using ERCP techniques, guide wires and catheters, you access that big dilated appendix, and you're using a balloon or a spyglass, and you clear out the fecalith or the appendicolith. Maybe you put a stent in that appendix, and the patient doesn't have surgery.
Yeah. I read about that for the first. So I was on the DDW for 3 years. I was on the abstract committee or the planning committee at one point. So I remember seeing a couple abstracts, and my eyes just went like, holy crap, you can do this.
Yeah. I don't know who invented it, but it's a brilliant idea. And, it's funny because we often have surgeons rotate with us. And I've shown more than a few surgeons like, hey, what do you think of this? And like, you could just see like all the blood just draining out of their face because they immediately jump to like, oh, that's not good. Okay. And the data for ERAT is quite good. I mean, clearly some people need an appendectomy, but it looks like an awful lot of people don't. Right. An awful lot of people can have appendix sparing therapy with a very, very high technical and clinical success rate, low recurrence rate. And I think that's probably not too long away from use in Europe and the USA, where it's not really being done yet. I mean, I guess you got to be willing to take those calls from the ER, and you got to have surgeons that are not going to go to war with you if you start doing that. Yeah. But I mean, it's that's going to be hard not to come here eventually.
Yeah, no, yeah, and the surgeons, I mean, I feel like, already we're starting to see a large growth in endobariatrics. We're starting to see a lot of interest in gallbladder drainage over the last 3 years with Axios and things like that. And, you can already start to see the wheels turning, like, okay, they're taking our gallbladders, they're taking our, their weight loss surgeries, and now they want to take
this gastrostomy, gastrojejunectomy.
Yeah. So it is, it may be a world in 5 years or 10 years where you don't go into GI, you go into endoscopy as a fellowship. You get surgical endoscopist or gastrointestinal endoscopist, but it's an endoscopy training as opposed to GI versus surgery. Yeah, no, that is something that I feel like that would be a large volume of cases for a lot of people, because especially in my centers that I'm at, the surgeons aren't eager to go to surgery the day. Like, when we were kids or younger, like, you had appendicitis, you got surgery the next day, and you got
an open appendectomy.
Yeah, and nowadays they're like, oh, just give me antibiotics for a week, and we'll see how they do, and then maybe we'll take their appendix out. And
there's been a lot of papers published on just pure antibiotic therapy alone.
Yeah.
And a fair number of people can avoid surgery entirely. And it looks like, and again, I haven't done ERAT myself, but it looks like technically it's very simple.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
No,
I think the problem for us is honestly, it's just the lack of an elevator on a colonoscope and being able to manipulate your sphinctertome or whatever catheter you're going to use to get the wire in there. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard. You should be able to get on FOSS with the appendix and do it. But, the tools may have to be adapted a little bit, but that's not a huge fix other than, just getting the industry on board with it.
yeah, no, I think that's changed a lot. I think third space has changed the world. I think, and I'm somebody who wasn't really interested in that, and now I'm doing quite a lot of it. I think I'm the highest GPOM provider in this whole part of the country. I'm sure I'm one of the 2 or 3 highest volume GPOM providers in the United States. Like, we're doing them at an incredible rate. We do a lot of Zenkers,
Right.
I think it's good to have like a foothold in this world. Like, I don't want to do every third space procedure, but I think it's important to have some of that if you're in advance. Like, it's good to sort of like understand sort of working in that plane and how those tools work. I think that has taken off in a way that few people really saw coming. For 20 years, that was like, yeah, when you went to Japan, they learned something. I don't really know what it was, but now it's here.
Yeah.
Now it's here, and we're doing it.
So let me ask you your opinion on this, because I've asked this question to a few of the other people I've interviewed in the past. And so what's your opinion on, do you see this becoming, you go in after GI fellowship and you do advanced endoscopy, and then do you see people further subspecializing into, maybe a 5th year of endobariatrics, advanced tissue resection, third space endoscopy, endohepatology, whatever the situation is? Like, do you see these all becoming separate tracks within advanced endoscopy? Do you see them being extra training years, or do you see them being part of a general advanced endoscopy fellowship? Like, if you had a glass ball or crystal ball, what do you think is going to be the?
I think they're probably going to stay in the 4th year, because we made GI 3 years. You're adding another year. Like, I think one thing that's very different now is people have traded depth for breadth. And like, for example, like I said, in my 4th year, I did ERCP all day long, every single day. Like, once in a blue moon, like a duodenal stent or a colonic stent or something. But that was an ERCP year.
Mm-hmm.
And like when I did my EUS with Doug, I did EUS all day long. Like, I walked into this room and I had 10 lined up, and I did EUS till there was no more EUS in the building to do, and then I walked out. And a lot of other things along the way, I just taught myself, learned from reading articles or had somebody show me a couple, and I just started doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now people are getting in their advanced years, ERCP, EUS, RFA, Barrett's, EMR, some third space, some kind of, though that having been said, most of the 4th years in this country are still overwhelmingly ERCP, EUS, with very little or no third space.
Right.
And they're just getting kind of like a bigger potpourri of stuff. So they're finishing with the same number of procedures, but they have less of each kind. So I think a lot of those people, when they get out, they're trying to decide what's my lane.
Right. That's what I told my fellows, because we're purely a private practice, and we were running an advanced endoscopy fellowship for the last 6 years. We've taken a break over the last 2 years just because of some of the politics with our practice parameters. But I told them, I said, we're not an advanced tissue resection place, so you're going to get EMR, but you're not going to do ESD. But you're going to learn ERCP. You're going to learn how to do a needle knife. You're going to learn how to do EMR. So you're going to have the building blocks to learn ESD, but you're going to have to seek advanced training or extra training somewhere else. You're going to learn how to, use electrocautery. You're going to learn how to gently work with the needle. You're going to learn how to inject. You're going to do all those things that are the building blocks for the next level, but you're not going to get the next level. And I think a majority of programs, that's what it is. You get your foundation, and then once you decide what it is you really want to do with your life, then you can explore that opportunity. And if you're in a great program that has everything, then you're very blessed and very lucky to be there. But a majority of the programs aren't that way. So,
and it also takes time to figure out what's right for you. When you're a fellow, you don't have any control of what's on the schedule. Like your attending's putting stuff on, your attending is answering those calls.
Right.
When you're the attending, you have to decide, do I want to do this? Do I want to do that? Like we do a ton of endohepatology. Like I think we just did our 75th US portal pressure.
Wow.
We'll get there. But, like we do gastric variceal coin, you know what I'm saying? But like our advanced fellows, like it'll be interesting to see in 5 or 10 years what they do when they got it. And they may be doing stuff that we didn't teach them at all.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is I did another podcast, which hasn't been published yet, but with a guy named Stuart Ackerman over there in Dallas. And yeah, as a fellow, you don't know what's out there. And kind of like I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of us who end up in pure private practice because that's what's available. And then the business model of private practice can hit you in the face. Like, okay, I want to be a partner, I've got to participate in the ASC. And if I want to participate in the ASC, I've got to be able to do cases there. So you end up compromising some of your advanced volume for general GI volume so that you can, get that hollow ground of partnership in an ASC and things like that. And so there's a lot of things that you don't realize, as fellows don't realize when they're training, because a lot of us aren't exposed to that. I mean, I know for certain in my general and advanced fellowships, I had one attendee who was a private practice guy who would talk about it, but the rest had no clue. So I didn't know what to expect for the most part when I got out in the real world. And it's interesting to see, because maybe some of your fellows are fantastic at endohepatology, but they never do another case the day they leave you. Right. Or maybe that's all they do.
The other thing too is, it used to be that therapeutics in this country was really confined to about 10 or 12 big university centers. And it's now diffused out everywhere. But, if you're at an 80-bed hospital, you may get a lot of pushback if you try doing some very high-end stuff. You may get pushback from your surgeons or your interventional radiologists, and you may get pushback from your hospital leadership. Like, yeah, that's not really appropriate here. You need to ship that patient to the university. And I've had more than a few people call me and say, like, I don't know what to do. Like, I have a good job. My kids are in school. I can't move. But my hospital is de facto telling me that what I want to do is too complicated for, a community hospital. And usually the hospital wins in that situation.
Oh yeah. No, my first cystgastrostomy I did in private practice in Gilbert, Arizona. There was a complication. The stent, actually, it was before Axios, so it was double pigtail stent.
Double pig.
I got the one in, and then I tried to put a second one alongside it, and that actually pushed the cyst off the wall. And so one stent was in the cyst and one stent was in the peritoneum. And the blowback from that for the next few weeks was pretty impressive. I was actually able to show data and literature and say that this is legitimate, but it was the first time anybody in that hospital had seen somebody do that, and it could have potentially been career altering for me at that point. So fortunately, Navix came out a few months later, and I was able to use that. So it get 2 wires and I was good, but it was challenging. Yeah. So
I think people now in the Axios era, like, they have no idea. like now, like, people love pseudocysts. Like, people didn't used to love it because it was like, well, God, all right, so I'll put a needle in, I'll inject some dye, I'll put a wire in, I'll try not to shear the wire and lose the coating and the cyst, and I'll dilate.
With a hurricane balloon.
And I'll put it, I'll get one double pig in, and then when I put the second double pig in, I got to re-access, and then hopefully the second double pig doesn't dislodge. Like, it was awful. And we did them, but, like, it wasn't something you kind of were like rah-rah on. I wasn't rah-rah on cystgastrostomy until Axios. Then I became very rah-rah overnight because it took all the pain out of it. But
it went from a 45-minute procedure to a 6-minute procedure,
Yeah, exactly. 45 minutes if you were lucky.
Yeah.
Right? Everything lined up.
We got to be careful here because we're starting to sound like Dana Carvey from early 90s Saturday Night Live, where in my day, we walked up both ways and we liked it.
Right. But it really, really, really was different. It's like, it's the difference between, like watching a movie on a VHS and streaming
Oh yeah.
on your phone. Like, it's so much easier now.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
We schedule our cystgastrostomies for 30 minutes. That's
Yeah.
the smallest slot we can schedule. But it's like you're saying, you're literally like, you look, you Doppler, looks great, deploy.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, 100%. And there's a little ego boost when you get a new endotech that worked in another hospital that they didn't do it at, and they see you do it, and they're you know what you're doing is not special, because a lot of people around the United States are doing it, but you feel special for that 30 seconds when you get those puppy dog eyes from a bunch of techs and nurses and stuff.
Right.
So
no, but we really do have much better technology now. Like, we have better tomes and catheters and wires and needles, and we're starting to get some good interventional US devices. Like, the space has grown tremendously. Like, our technology is just better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I've said this before in different podcasts. I think if you're an interventionalist, if you're not a technophile, or you're not somebody who loves technology or devices, you really should be an interventionalist, because you really have to learn to love these things and be a part of the process of developing them, because Scott Hack and I talked about it, and really you and I and people like us and the generation that's graduating each year, we're the ones that are giving the companies the feedback about, like, this is what we need, and if we don't get into that world, our field will just stagnate. So absolutely have to. So what are some of the advice? What is some of the advice you'd give to graduating fellows who are looking at a career in interventional endoscopy? Obviously you and I are very pro interventional, but what are the things that you kind of highlight or tout to students and residents who are looking at a career in GI and specifically interventional?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say a couple things. I would say that ask yourself, what is your risk tolerance, right? And really be honest about that, right? Everybody wants to fly the F-16, but most pilots fly cargo. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
What is your risk tolerance for that? And then you also, I think, this is something that Mike Levy taught me, was that interventional means staying late.
Yeah.
And then just recognize that if you're the interventionalist, you're often the last person to go home.
Yeah.
Because, you can always push that colonoscopy till tomorrow. But, if somebody's jaundice or his cholangitis are on the list and they got to go, you know what I'm saying? Like, they're waiting for a cancer diagnosis. Like, you can't go home until the list is done. So I think that a lot of people also don't realize that your hours are de facto longer. And I remember when I was a fourth year, like my first, Mike Levy was my attending the first week. And like the first 3 days, we got out at like 9, 10 o'clock. And I was like, Mike, what's going on? and he said, doing advanced means staying late. I won't do it in his accent.
Yeah.
And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because it does. And he was right. So, like, there's the glamour part of it. Like, you get to do the fun, wild cases, but, you're not getting out at 4.
No, 100%.
It's not. And I guess I would say, this is a whole other podcast, advice to aspiring advanced people. I think we did that over at the GIE podcast, but I would say really, really, really ask yourself, like which 1 or 2 procedures do you want to really focus on? Like, are you an ERCP EUS person? Do you want to be the endobariatrician, or do you want to be the jumbo polyp ESD guy? Because it is hard to do absolutely everything. And I think some people come out and they think that they can do everything everywhere, and you just kind of can't, because it's all opportunity cost. Like, if you want to do a lot of X, it takes away slots to do Y or Z. So at the end of the day, you have to kind of pick the procedures and the diseases that interest you most, and you do have to let stuff go. And that's often very, very difficult for people.
100%. And you have to also add the confounding factor of, are you a family person? Do you have kids? Do you have a spouse? What is their tolerance?
Children and spouse.
Yeah. What is their tolerance for you coming home at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock every night, or 10 o'clock every night, whatever the case might be? And I tell all general GI fellows, I like, number one, the same thing. What's your risk tolerance? And the other thing is you're staying late and you're not necessarily making more than your general GI colleagues.
You might very well be making less.
Yeah. For the number of hours you work, you're not the best paid guy in the practice, for the most part.
Right.
And
right.
So,
you also have to work for your cases, right? I mean, if you're in general GI, the cases just roll in from PCPs, who see 30 outpatient clinics a day, and they need people to do screening colons and look for GERD. Like, it's much easier for those people to fill the schedule. Whereas in advanced, you have to actively work to find cases to be put on your schedule. Because if you don't actively work, you're going to find yourself doing general GI.
Yeah, you're going to be doing a lot of thumb twiddling at times. Yeah. So it's definitely it's absolutely something that you have to work for, and the reward is for you. It's not necessarily to your wallet. It's not necessarily to your family. It's for you and for what you really want to be doing. So, that's a question I ask a lot of people. Is like, are you sure you want to do this? I mean, are you just fascinated by the fact that it was cool as to drain that pseudocyst? But the reality is, there's a lot of work and there's a lot of program going that has to happen.
Right. And what a lot of people don't see is that patient then needs 3 necrosectomies and 2 clinic visits and a celiac block and a pain referral, remember that axial stent opening up and that gunk gushing out.
Yeah.
But, that's just like step 1 of like 11 steps for that patient.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And then you got to have 4 meetings in clinic to tell them to stop smoking. Right?
Or drinking.
You don't see all that, but that's like what you're thinking. You're like, well, this guy, he's taking 10 shooters a day and he's smoking a pack of Marlboros. Like, I got my work cut out for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to ask you one other quick thing. So I as part of this podcast, I stock all my if people even
here we go.
So you have a side hustle where you do some writing, and you want to share a little bit about that? I think it's fascinating to get into people's hobbies.
It's not a secret. I have a side gig. I call it my side gig, where I have a little side career where I write about aviation, aerospace, and astronomy.
Okay.
So I think I mentioned earlier that I contemplated getting a PhD in astronomy as an undergraduate. I've always been interested in these topics. I learned to fly a couple of years ago.
Awesome.
I just realized that there was really no reason for me not to start writing about this stuff. So I think as of now, I've published about 75 magazine articles on the 3 A's: aviation, aerospace, and astronomy. And like literally right before this podcast, I was working on an article about aerospace. So it's good to have a non-medical outlet. I've never golfed. Like, I don't know if you golf.
Rarely, about 6 times a year. I'm not good at it. So
I've never golfed in my life. I'm not a golfing doc, but in my day off or my free time, I'm researching liquid oxygen or monomethyl hydrazine as alternative rocket fuels. And I'm, writing articles about, reaction chamber thrust vectors and stuff like that. So that stuff isn't hard to find, but those articles are all out there, and I'm very, very proud of them. I've gotten to interview some really, really, really interesting people over the years doing that, including a couple of the Apollo astronauts, moonwalkers. So, it's opened a lot of interesting doors for me.
No, it's super important. I mean, for the younger physicians listening who are looking at careers, in GI or interventional endoscopy, you have to have that outlet. I mean, honestly, that's why I started doing a podcast. I mean, I started thinking about it, when I was in college at the University of Arizona. I was only there for a year, and then I moved to India. But my goal for my sophomore year was to actually apply to be a disc jockey at this university radio station.
When there was radio.
When there was radio, yeah. And one of my goals as a kid, I wanted to be on the radio, I just medical school, residency, fellowship. And then this world of podcasting. I started listening to podcasts. I was like, wait a minute. I always wanted to be on the radio. This is like my way of doing it,
Even better in some ways.
So this is my hobby. And, I think, writing about astronomy or aviation, I mean, like that's a passion of yours. That's get your mind off the, the bad cases and the difficult cases and things like that for sure.
Yeah. It's good to sort of like, be known in something else. Like I've got, I've got some real street cred in that world, No, it's just true. Like
it's awesome. Yeah.
Written a lot. So like, it's kind of fun to have like, and that's just a whole other universe. So it's good to have like a foothold there.
No, like my first advanced fellow that I trained, Farhud Khosravi, he became a partner of mine. But when he was my fellow, he had two hobbies that were so unique that one of them he doesn't do anymore, but he was doing MMA fighting in a gym. And he would show up to do ERCPs and his knuckles were all bruised and he had a black eye. I'm like, what the heck happened to you, man? And he started explaining that, he was
punching people.
Yeah, as an exercise. But then he quit that. And now he's got a successful side gig as an EDM DJ. So he's in Scottsdale once a month. He's playing shows and, he's on a record label and things like that. He's a GI by night and a DJ, or GI by day and DJ by night. And so it's, you have to have an outlet and be, a little bit more than just your job, So.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's very rewarding. So whenever that other thing is, like,
find it, yeah.
But you have something. Again, I'm not a golfer, but I have the 3 A's.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. I mean, you've got a lot going on. It's a Saturday afternoon. I really, really appreciate this, and thank you so much. Before we leave, just a couple announcements that I make for all the listeners. If you haven't joined any of your societies, you really should. Specific to interventional endoscopy, ASGE and FIGHT are two of the societies out there right now that are really helping us get reimbursement and continue our craft and really grow. So really join and support your societies and participate as much as possible. And then for those of you who might be struggling with mental health issues, GI medicine is a stressful world. Patients have high demands. Families have high demands. Your own family will have a demand. And it can add up. So if you are struggling, reach out to colleagues, get some help, Better Health, all these different websites out there are available. And just, don't struggle alone. There's a big community, a big tribe behind you. So this is, our one of the things I really believe in for the listeners. So Dr. Douglas Adler here as our guest. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Please hit that like button and that subscribe button.